Hmm.
But New Mexico, seeing that on your shirt, the state as well. Growing up, Ancient Aliens on the History Channel, I was like a big history buff. I used to always watch the show, and I would see them talk about like the Hopi, that civilization, Native Americans studying other stars, and they would try to talk about extraterrestrials. From my own perspective, I would think it was kind of Eurocentric to even try to say, well, the only way that these people knew about these stars and all these other things, and same in Africa, how they knew all the same type of information because aliens had to share this. With that all being said, though, do you feel like with the Hopi and even in New Mexico, of course, that aliens sometimes affected our studies of the stars?
So let me go back a step and go
Mm-hmm.
forward per your question.
Mm-hmm.
Every civilization has identified beings that somehow assist or are co-present
Mm-hmm.
in some dimension of our evolution and have called them by different names.
Mm-hmm.
Angels,
Yeah.
daemons, not to be confused with demons, but spirits who are around us. So the language that we use, aliens, has really emerged from our mechanistic understanding of how we encounter the cosmos, meaning,
Mm-hmm.
through spaceships, through whatever. And it could be that we're talking about interdimensional beings that could be along the same lines as the jinn,
Yeah.
as the Nomo,
Mm-hmm.
as the other levels of beings that many different civilizations have encountered.
Yeah.
And I say that all to say, like, well, are they aliens? I don't know. They're
Mm-hmm.
something, but
Yeah.
what they are, I don't know what they are, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they could be just along this, like interdimensional or kind of some other kinds of beings. So I do think that there are the presence of these beings that have been present, but to think like they have to come from some place named Vulcan or Numomo or La Blah Blah or
Mm-hmm.
whatever or Planet X
Mm-hmm.
is more a fixation of our era
Mm.
than say the truth. We
Yeah.
don't know what the truth is.
Yeah.
It's just our understanding and conception of history
Mm.
and time. There's another, and you tapped on it a little bit already. There's another narrative that we have to be attentive to,
Mm-hmm.
which is like, y'all didn't do that. You had
Mm.
aliens.
Somebody had to help you.
Someone had to help you
Yeah. Yeah.
without acknowledging, like, well, did those aliens stop doing the ish that you were doing during your Renaissance in Europe?
Mm.
Right? Because how did y'all
Point.
get to the point you were able to build the way you did when you basically didn't even have running water in your streets?
Mm.
Like, you know, so if we check the historical record, maybe it was Moors. Maybe Moors helped you. Maybe they weren't aliens.
Mm.
Maybe they were darker skinned people,
Mm.
who had been working with things,
Mm.
and understanding mathematics and different dimensions of what you now call science
That's
that
right.
assisted you. So
Yeah.
there's that narrative, and then
Yeah.
there's the other narrative of understanding that there's a way in which we could look at the encounters with the mysterious and
Mm.
say there's something, but we
Mm.
don't know exactly what they are. But
Mm.
it's kind of simplistic to say, well, they're aliens. We don't. There's something.
Mm. Yeah. No, that's good. So, as a black astrologer, right? Do you think that astrology sometimes has components of whitewashing Africa's contributions towards this space of studying the stars in the heavens?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting to hear, some of my white colleagues talk about Egypt and Hellenistic astrology.
Hmm.
Now, there are some facts. The development of what we now call in the West horoscopic astrology, which is not
Mm-hmm.
to be confused with the Indic or quote unquote Vedic astrology that also developed along certain lines, similar lines, but different lines in India or what we call the subcontinent now.
Mm-hmm.
But, they'll talk about Hellenistic astrology, and one particular set of facts is that yes, there were people who came from Greece and from Macedonia into Egypt and largely colonized Egypt, bringing their whiteness, right?
Yep.
This is true. But in that encounter, they also encountered an older civilization that
Mm.
drew all the way up the Nile, because the Nile flows from the south to the north, right?
Yep.
All the way up the Nile,
Mm.
and that becomes some of the conditioning influences of what becomes horoscopic astrology as well. So that is African,
Mm.
happening in Africa.
Right.
And I think that sometimes gets lost. And then Europeans get tricky. They're like, well, we're not talking about sub Saharan Africa.
Mm.
That's your arbitrary distinction related to Africa. That's not Africans' designation and understanding of themselves.
Mm.
So, that's to kind of preserve, or the necessity of your quote unquote whiteness,
Mm-hmm.
which has nothing to, and it's fascinating to see if you study the history of Europe. And when I say history of Europe, because, well, I learned that in school. Well, what our school teachers don't tell us is the conception of even the phrase and the terminology Europe. It's based on Zeus um, actually accosting and raping a Phoenician princess who
Mm.
largely was in what we now would call Libya, or
Wow.
along that rim that we call Africa, whose name was Europa,
Yep.
and then took her into the land of the setting sun, which
Mm.
means the West, which now becomes Europe.
Mm.
So this idea of Europe, of whiteness, all kind of comes terminously from the mid millennium, last millennium, of trying to set itself apart from its darker skin roots, or its roots more to the south,
Mm-hmm.
without acknowledging. So, for instance, they claim Greece as an ancient civilization. Just study a little Greek history, and the Greek history, Greek historians would say, like, we don't have anything to do with those people in the north.
Wow.
They're barbarians, right?
Mm. Yep.
They would be horrified to be like, you think you Gaul, you Goth, you Visigoth, you German are like us? You're
Mm.
nothing like us. But
Mm.
there's this belief in the continuity of European history, which necessitates that they have to marginalize African history. And that largely
Mm.
to draw, not going back to the point,
Yeah.
it's largely to draw the pool from which we draw modern astrology.
Wow. That's great. Ancient Egypt, right, on that same standpoint, whether it's the Great Pyramids of Giza and you see how they align perfectly with Orion's belt. And it's like
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about thousands upon thousands of years ago before they had what all the great technology that we have now, before the telescopes and all these other people and construction sites, all of these things. How were our people so advanced back then, being able to align pyramids perfectly with Orion's belt?
Well, they have been studying the stars for centuries.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things we seem to forget, so the earliest documented, um, in terms of Egypt, is Narmer's tablet, something called Narmer's tablet that we have. I think it goes back 6,000 years. And, we think of it as advanced, but just think about this. If you're, this is just the earliest estimation, this could be going back farther, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you go back 7,000 years and you get to the point where, like, say around the time of, building the pyramids of Giza, let's say that's 4,000, 3,000 BCE.
Mm-hmm.
That means you've had 4,000 years of observation. Just
Man.
imagine what, because we seem to think like, oh, in our 2,000 years, we've come so far. It's only been like 2,000 years from the putative birth of Christ.
Wow.
So, I mean, I think they had time,
Mm.
and I don't think we make it miraculous. How could they have done that? Well, I think some measure of it, their eyes probably were sharper.
Yeah.
The sky was sharper, in sharper
Mm.
relief without light pollution. Um, and they were fascinated. I mean, it was a lot more important that they didn't have paper. You
Mm.
know, it was a lot more. a necessity for their survival, or felt that they it was for their survival in understanding the world around them, and it was. They
Mm,
didn't have all the different dimensions of control that we would develop over the millennia.
mm,
So I think, they say necessity is the mother of invention. I think they were
mhm,
dealing with necessity. And then they were trying to get with a certain sense of alignment,
mm.
in understanding that.
Yeah,
So I think that was the push.
that's good. There's this old saying, of course, as above, so below.
I was just writing that. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Well,
So,
yeah, the full statement, as above, as below, as within, so without, as a
mm,
cosmos, or as a universe, so the soul.
mm, wow. So, do you think that the heavens predicts and reflects what is going on currently, right down
That's
here,
a
all
big
the time?
that's a big question, because there are some astrologers who would say it does predict, it does foretell.
Mm,
I often think it reflects. I think there's a dynamic. Um, there's a dynamic, and by virtue of that dynamic, it may spell out, but how we interpret that becomes, a matter of, you know, human invention and creativity and imagination. So,
mm,
we said we were going to have an interview. That is
mm,
what we might say as prediction, foretelling. That's what predict means,
mm,
predict, right?
mm, mm,
But the nature of how this interview goes, how it
mm,
becomes a story between us,
mm.
that's dictated by our interaction,
Yeah.
rather than saying, like, okay, Sam, because you didn't send questions. That's not a
Mm,
slight. Like, you didn't
mhm,
send questions and I didn't read answers, right? It's a flow. And
mhm,
so we allowed it to be alive
mm.
that way. So I think we can see that kind of story between as above, so below, as another kind of way of looking at it. Now, some astrologers who would, from previous eras or even now, be like, no, that means you're pretty much what the stars say you are.
Mm,
Um, I'm not one of those astrologers, but um, I'm more so say that there's some things that are prescribed, just like you and I are black men.
mm,
So that is going to prescribe some measure of how we live a
mm.
certain way.
Yeah.
You and I, okay, you probably know what I'm going to say in this regard. When I go into a store, I make sure my hands are seen. I don't
Mm,
have my hands in the pockets, right?
mm,
Or whatever, because I
mm,
know the dialogue, right? Especially if it's a smaller store, because, you know, if your hands are always in your pockets, then there's some measure of suspicion. Now,
mm,
that's prescribed by virtue of our understanding of our color and
mm,
our masculinity,
mm,
right? So you're like, well, does that mean you are going to be at the? No, it just means how I interact with the world with a certain awareness that's prescribed by the society I live in. We could
wow.
say some measure of that is also seen related to the stars, but that
Mm,
doesn't mean that um, we can't find hacks, ways in which we code and decode,
yeah.
recode, even,
Mm,
how life happens.